Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, I'm John Sisbody, a true and welcome to something I've been thinking about for a long time. The place of speech in Fallout and all the problems it's created over the years. So today, we're going to be talking history, we're going to be talking Fallout games that never were, and we're going to be talking about the time we almost got to specialise in carousing in Fallout. So, let's begin with one of the most well-loved Fallout games, New Vegas. You see, Fallout New Vegas is unique in the franchise in that it tells you right at the start how the game is going to end. Before you actually start playing, you know there's a battle coming for Hoover Dam to decide the fate of Vegas. And no matter what path you choose, that's where the game's going to end. In 3 of the 4 endings, you'll be facing off against Lanius. You hear how he slaughters a 10th of his own men as punishment on the radio. Caesar tells you the story of a man who attacked entire Legion patrols alone, and who was so fierce as a warrior that he turned on his own village when they tried to surrender to the Legion. He became the Monster of the East, the Butcher. And finally, at the end of the game, after cutting your way through the Second Battle of Hoover Dam, after charging ahead of the rest of the army into the Legate's camp by yourself, you face him, and you tell him to go away. And he does. Because Fallout has a long-running problem with speech. It's been fairly consistently one of the most powerful skills in the game, capable of automatically diffusing conflicts and completing quests in moments. And this goes back so far that just about any character build guide you can find for the classic Fallout recommends you tag speech under all circumstances, no matter what else you're planning to do with the builds. So how did this happen? Well, to answer that, we need to go back in time, and probably further than you're expecting, all the way back to 1986, the year that Steve Jackson developed GURPS. Now, depending on how well you know your RPG history, there might have been some unfamiliar words in that last sentence. Steve Jackson is an American game designer who you might better recognise as the creator of Munchkin. He's also delightfully nerdy and enjoys pirate-themed Lego and model trains. But perhaps his greatest creation is GURPS, the generic universal role-playing system. A set of game mechanics for tabletop role-playing games with a strong focus on versatility. Unlike most of its contemporaries, it was a role-playing game that had the flexibility to support games in just about any conceivable setting, rather than being designed exclusively for, say, high fantasy. So how does that fit into Fallout? Well, originally, and for perhaps a surprisingly large part of its development, the original Fallout of 1997 was going to fully utilise GURPS for its core game mechanics. The deal was signed in 1995 and dropped some time after that, though there is some disagreement over the exact reasons for the split. Brian Fargo in 2011 commented that it was due to Steve Jackson's objections to some of Fallout's more adult content. As a result of that, the Fallout team had to remove the GURPS system and develop their own instead, giving us the now iconic Special system. But here's where we can detect the origin of the speech problem, because we have a small handful of screenshots of Fallout from this stage of development, or, to be precise, Vault 13, a GURPS post-nuclear adventure as it was called at the time, which were released by Chris Taylor in 2007, giving us a look at what the game might have been like had the deal not fallen through. And straight away, you'll notice that the available skills were very different indeed. And I want to draw your attention in particular to one skill that didn't make it into Fallout: carousing, a skill about partying and socialising, which also includes low-level dancing ability according to the GURPS wiki. Now, that probably sounds very specific, and it is, and now we need to dive a little bit deeper into GURPS and how it works. You see, the reason GURPS is flexible enough to cover just about any conceivable setting for a role-playing game is the game includes just about any conceivable skill. Falconry, stage combat, fire eating, accounting, sumo wrestling, housekeeping, heraldry, exorcism, speed reading, anthropology, freight handling, and well over 100 more. Now, that does not mean that Fallout would ever have actually had that many skills available. The point of all those skills is that developers can choose skills that are appropriate to the setting they want to build a game in. So, a bunch of skills that are explicitly magical or appropriate for medieval societies wouldn't have been included. But the crucial point here is that in this vast array of skills, there is no speech skill. Instead, there are, depending on how you define speech, between 10 and 15. Now, we have no way of knowing how many would have ended up in the theoretical GURPS Fallout, but we do know that carousing was in one build of the game at some point. and given that carousing does exclusively cover socialising in a particular setting in GURPS, and we can see how karate and brawling, or pistol fast draw and guns pistol are separated in GURPS, we can be very confident there would have been other social skills beyond carousing. To my mind, the most likely candidates would probably have been streetwise and savoir-faire, the latter being the ability to conduct yourself properly and say the right things in high society, the former more appropriate for engaging with rough company. Now, I flagged those two in particular as just before Fallout came out in 1996, The Elder Scrolls II Daggerfall released with two very similar matching speech skills, etiquette and streetwise, but there are plenty of other options in GURPS too. Diplomacy, public speaking, intimidation, they'd all be viable. The point, however, is that there was almost certainly more than one speech skill, and this is very important for role-playing, because it means that no character simply has natural charisma so strong that they can talk down literally anybody in any situation, because 1, that's unrealistic, and 2, there's a danger that will be overpowered. But then the change happened from GURPS to Fallout, and we can see from the GURPS character sheet a bunch of formerly available skills went missing. Karate and brawling merged into unarmed. Pistols, rifles, and skills related to their use all merged into small guns, and however many speech skills had once been intended for Fallout, they all blended together into a single one, speech. As a result of that, speech was conceptually very powerful, as a high speech skill would get you access to all the best hidden dialogue options, such as, say, the ability to easily resolve the Khan's kidnapping of Tandy, or getting past the mutants at the water pump. Despite this powerful single blended speech skill, however, I think overall Fallout 1 did a competent job at balancing the power of speech. So how did they square the circle? Well, to my mind, it was a consequence of the setting. In Fallout 1, society is at its least developed in the entire Fallout universe, with the possible exception of Fallout 3. Huge areas are empty wasteland. Tiny villagers struggle to survive against the monsters of the wastes. Deathclaws are a horror story even in the relatively advanced hub, and the vast majority of the super mutant army won't engage in conversation at all, either ignoring you or shooting on sight. The key point here is that Fallout 1 is filled with situations where society's biggest problem is a scary monster in the wilderness, right from the very first encounter with Shady Sands. There is no speech solution to Shady Sands' first quest because you cannot negotiate with rad scorpions. In Aditum, you cannot talk down Deathclaws. In the Wasteland, many of the hostiles you encounter physically cannot communicate with you. On occasion, speech is extremely useful. At other times, it has no utility whatsoever. This, to my mind, is a fair balance. I've never expected every problem to have a perfect solution no matter what skills you've invested in. Part of the joy of building a character is that some scenarios become very easy because you're well suited to dealing with them. Meanwhile, others are relatively tricky if you don't have a specialisation appropriate to the situation. And this right here is where I think Fallout 2 went wrong. Now, I can't find much discussion on this topic from the original dev team, so I can't really say whether what I'm about to discuss was the result of an intentional design choice in the making of Fallout 2, or an oversight that came about in error. You see, the world of Fallout 2 is much bigger than the world of Fallout 1, and specifically, it's much more populated. Fallout 1 had 12 major locations, of which around half could be considered towns of some description. Civilian population, shops, quest givers, that sort of thing. The other half are neutral or hostile environments, like the ruins of Vault 15, the Raider Camp or the Glow, though there are some edge cases like Necropolis or the Boneyard, where large parts of the area are monster-infested ruins. Fallout 2 is built very differently. Of its 24 main locations, a good 80% of them are towns, and those towns are much larger than they were in Fallout 1, with the majority made up of multiple large external districts. In short, you're spending a much higher proportion of your time in an urban environment, talking to people. On top of that, almost nobody is scared of nearby monsters that need to be hunted down. The majority of quests instead take the form of a conflict between two groups of people. In some cases, this uses the structure of a pair of towns that can be reconciled, Modoc and the Ghost Farm, or Vault City and Gecko, and sometimes it's an entirely internal political issue, like in Reading and the factions that favour siding with various outside powers. Again, the key point here is the huge increase in the number of people you're dealing with on a regular basis. You spend your time in towns, talking to people who want you to deal with other people on their behalf. This means you spend a very large amount of the game in dialogue. and naturally that means the speech skill got elevated from a good skill to an almost compulsory one. In brief, speech worked well in Fallout 1 because the world was evenly divided between times when it was useful and times it wasn't. In Fallout 2, the world is filled with a lot more opportunities to use speech, but the skill stayed the same regardless. Fallout 2, in fact, would have been the perfect game to have separated streetwise versus savoir-faire skills. Just consider Vault City, where the former would serve you well in the outlying slums, while the latter would help with speaking with elite citizens. Instead, speech just works for everybody. Now obviously an imbalanced skill system where one skill is clearly superior to others is fundamentally not desirable, but let's dig into exactly why this creates a problem for Fallout 2. In brief, to my mind, it's because it teaches you a bad lesson. Let's say you start a game of Fallout 2 having never played it before, and you choose to focus on speech. At the end of the Temple of Trials, you can bypass the final fight with a speech check. Great, that's a useful way to avoid combat. But it never stops. Speech gets you straight into Vic's room. Speech gets you an immediate free day pass to access Vault City. You can speech Ken Lee into just giving you access to the Emperor and the fuel. In a single conversation, persuade an Enclave scientist to sabotage his own life's work and murder his colleagues. Every investment in speech just seems to be more and more rewarded, right until the last 5 minutes of the game. The final boss, Frank Corrigan, cannot be reasoned with in any way. The only way to finish the game is for him to die. Speech can get you a few extra Enclave soldiers on your side, but they will be destroyed by Horrigan. The only viable way for a non-combat focused Chosen One to defeat Horrigan is to turn the automatic defenses on him. But no amount of science can do that. You must have a keycard held by President Richardson, who also can't be speech checked in any way. However, killing him to get the card would also trigger the rest of the Enclave to turn on you, so again tricky for a non-combat specialist, to the extent that, in fact, many Fallout 2 guides recommend a strange manipulation involving jabbing him with large numbers of super stimpaks to kill him through stacked health debuffs. It's a very strange finale to Fallout 2, where suddenly a skill that has up to this point resolved pretty much every problem in the world suddenly has basically no utility at the end of the game, and to my mind any player that feels a bit frustrated at that decision would be justified. And the fault lies with Fallout 2 for not balancing its skills more evenly, as was the case in Fallout 1. Of course, Fallout 1 has one other advantage here too: the Master. Unlike Horrigan, Fallout 1's Master confrontation has a huge number of options available to the player. Combat, of course, taking place in an environment that you can manipulate to your advantage, in this case by acquiring an item to nullify the Master's psychic attacks, but with other options too, using alternative skills to sneak into the back room and destroy the entire base by blowing up the reactor without ever meeting the Master, or, crucially, talking him down if you had compelling evidence you could present to him to prove his plan was doomed. An endgame resolution that bafflingly has never reappeared in any future Fallout game. So, that was the state of speech in the Interplay era, but there is one other very interesting piece of evidence about how the dev team might have gone on to look at speech and its role in Fallout. I'd suggest that Black Isle realised speech was a problem in Fallout 2 after the fact, because we know from documents that have emerged about the cancelled Fallout 3, Van Buren, that during at least one iteration of the game's development, speech was not going to be in Interplay's Fallout 3. Instead, it was going to be split into persuasion and deception, making it much harder for a character to quickly max out social skills and thus be able to work around any problem. But that didn't happen. Instead, we got Bethesda's Fallout 3. And okay, this one's complicated. Fallout 3 kind of doubled down on some of where Fallout 2 went wrong with speech. At its highest level, it is once again a god tier skill, but now, rather than most things, speech solves everything. So let's just go through the main plot of Fallout 3. You leave Vault 101 and arrive at Megaton. Moriarty knows where your father went and immediately tells you with a speech check. That leads you to Galaxy News Radio, where 3Dog wants you to help him. Use a speech check, you don't need to bother, he'll point you straight onto Rivet City. Project Purity then can't be speeched, as it contains nothing but mutants, but after that, 2 of Tranquility Lane's tasks can be easily speeched. If you fancy some side questing in the meantime, speech will resolve Blood Ties, Tenpenny Tower, Power of the Atom, Rescue from Paradise, Trouble on the Home Front, Superhuman Gambit, basically the vast majority of named quests. Back to the main plot, and after the Waters of Life is done, you can head to Little Lamplight and bypass Paradise Falls entirely with a speech check. After a brief run through Vault 87, you can speech the president into self-destructing, then nip back to Project Purity to speech the final boss into walking away. So, speeching the final boss is back, but unlike in Fallout 1, it doesn't need any form of evidence or preparation. A basic speech roll will take care of it. This is particularly frustrating because Fallout 3 does contain a quest where to get the optimal ending, you have to locate a piece of evidence that gives your character the context to challenge another character and force them to open up to you more than they would have done otherwise. And that's the Superhuman Gambit, where your character doesn't know the antagonizer is a comic book villain unless they've tracked down Hubris Comics and found a letter to the editor about the comic. Why such an elegant solution that surely must have been inspired by Fallout 1 is reserved exclusively for this small subquest in the corner of the map is unclear, and it's a huge shame that such elegant mechanics don't appear elsewhere, particularly in the main plots. But what's the real problem here? Because conceptually I don't object to the ability to use skills to bypass combat and create alternative solutions. On the contrary, that's kind of the point of a skill-based RPG. So let's get into some specifics here. Firstly, like in Fallout 2, speech is vastly more useful than other skills. Specifically, while there are plenty of uses for lockpick or science say, during main quest discussions and major confrontations, it will inevitably always be speech that comes up. In the final confrontation with Autumn, the choice is fight or speech. There are no other options. This means that underinvestment in other skills may lead to a handful of missed opportunities, but underinvestment in speech leads to major missed chances to bypass otherwise difficult fights or sections of the game. And secondly, speaking of bypass, yes, we need to discuss exactly what speech does in Fallout 3. So let's do a quick comparison. At the start of Fallout New Vegas, you do Ghost Town Gunfight, where you can use a speech check to persuade the townsfolk to join you in a shootout, evening the odds when the Powder Gangers show up. At the start of Fallout 3, meanwhile, Moriarty wants you to go and deal with Silver, but if you speech check him, you don't need to. He just gives you the information even though you've never been there. Now, do you see the critical difference here? In Fallout New Vegas, the speech check led to a modified quest where you still needed to do the gunfight because the gunfight is fun, but you could make it easier for yourself, tip the odds more in your favour. In Fallout 3, you just straight up skipped some of the game. You never meet Silver if you do the speech check. And this happens a lot. The worst example to my mind is Three Dog. Normally, he wants to send you to the Museum of Technology, a beautifully designed little dungeon full of lockpick and science checks, a creepy atmosphere, your first solo encounter with multiple super mutants, and even a secret unmarked quest to find a unique gun if you check all the terminals. It's a really fun area. But if you do the speech check with Three Dog, he just pushes you straight on to Rivet City instead. It's genuinely slightly baffling that Bethesda went to all the effort of creating this really cool area, the mall, the museum itself, and then just let you skip it. I promise, guys, I want to play the game, that's why I bought it. And the same thing happens again with skipping Paradise Falls entirely with the speech check at the Gates of Little Lamplight, skipping another well-designed area and the really cool quest within it. The problems with this generation of Fallout were also exacerbated by the changes to how skills overall worked. Back in old Fallout, skills were expressed by a percentage, between 0 and 300. However, raising a skill became increasingly more expensive in terms of skill point investment as the skill got higher, representing the diminishing returns you were seeing once you were already a skilled practitioner, making it extremely difficult and inefficient to max out any skill, as once the skill was approaching 200%, you were increasing it so little per level that most players would invest elsewhere in other skills to get more of an appreciable benefit. This was one mechanism by which speech in old Fallout avoided being completely out of control. The best speech checks could be behind skill levels so high that only those who invested at huge expense elsewhere would ever be able to use them. In Fallout 3, that changed. Skills were now between 0 and 100, with no diminishing returns as you continued to invest. Combined with an extremely generous skill point reward for high intelligence characters, you could leave the vault with a tagged speech skill of around 40 and hit speech 100, literally the highest it can go, by level 4, and that's without any skill books or perk boosts. Now, in Fallout 3's defense, it did try to mitigate this by making speech a skill roll that used both the speech stat and charisma to give you a percentage chance to succeed. But honestly, that just led to large amounts of save scumming, and the possibility of characters who weren't very good at speech at all passing difficult checks anyway with a bit of patience and the quick load button. There were, however, some good additions. new perks unlock dialogue of a particular flavour, for example, either towards seduction with Black Widow or Ladykiller, or for speaking to children with Child at Heart. This was a welcome way of rewarding those who wanted to roleplay in a particular direction with unique dialogue, though 2 steps forward, 1 step back, they were curiously undermined by not being locked behind any noteworthy charisma or speech gate. In fact, literally any character, even if completely uncharismatic and appalling at speaking, can be a master of seduction in Fallout 3 at level 2. And so along came New Vegas, and Obsidian of course made some changes. It is however hard to say how much New Vegas represents the compromises of the engine and timescale that Obsidian were given. For example, would Obsidian with a free hand have kept skills limited to between 0 and 100, or restored a system more like the old Fallout? We can't tell and can only judge what we have in front of us. So the biggest change was the removal of charisma from the chance to succeed speech checks, thus converting speech into a simple numerical check. If you had enough speech, you passed. Unfortunately, while this did remove any reason to spam save and load, in some ways it made the ongoing problem even worse. Now, once you hit speech 100, you would always, without fail, pass every single speech challenge. And with charisma now basically not doing anything, there was almost no reason to take it at all. And so it was that the Charisma 1 Speech 100 character was born, and over the years, countless Lanii have been chased off the field by level 7 speedrunners who managed to manipulate the monster of the East into retreating despite being literally the least charismatic characters possible. Though perhaps a part of the issue here is how New Vegas finally made us directly confront the issue with speech that's been hanging around since Fallout 3. One of the problems with speech is it's never been gamified. You see, back in the days of old Fallout, everything was based on probabilities. Chance to hit, probability. Chance to unlock a door, probability. Chance to hack a terminal, probability. But as of Fallout 3 and the move into a 3D real-time world, combat moved, at least partly, into a player skill-based system, where your abilities as a player could lead to better results. Equally, the same thing happened with other skills. Lockpick and science both came with mini-games that got progressively harder, with harder locks and passwords that could be failed to seal the door or terminal, so the player needs to have both the right in-game skill to begin the mini-game and the appropriate level of player skill to complete it. Speech, however, has never gone through this transition. It remains a flat character skill-based ability, where player skill has no impact on it whatsoever. Once you have that skill up to 100, and we've established that's very easy to do, if a speech check comes up, it's an auto win button. Now, we'll come back to what that means precisely later. Fortunately, as we've established before, unlike in Fallout 3, speech in New Vegas generally opens up interesting new gameplay opportunities rather than bypassing content that you presumably wanted to see after buying a Fallout game. And to further defend New Vegas, there is of course plenty it did right. While, just like in Fallout 2, the environment is heavily urban, with plenty of towns all over the place, speech is not so overwhelmingly used. Instead, other skills routinely appear in dialogue as if they were speech checks, along with reputation checks, perk-specific statements, even the odd option that comes from karma or items in your inventory, making New Vegas probably the most well-balanced Fallout game in terms of speech versus other skills since Fallout 1, even if it does slightly fluff the landing by ending with a very dull series of Speech 100 checks. And so we move on to Fallout 4, and I like a lot about Fallout 4, but when it comes to speech, no. And, you know, we can hardly start anywhere else than by saying that Fallout 4 partly dealt with the speech skill problem by getting rid of the speech skill, which was followed, of course, a few years later by Fallout 76, which got rid of speech, and characters to speak to as well. Bloody hell, Bethesda, there were a lot of babies in that bathwater. Sorry, that was mean. So, yes, Fallout 4, speech as a skill is now exclusively a function of charisma. Now, in the world of Fallout 4, with far fewer special points than ever before, this isn't necessarily a terrible idea, nor is the level up system of players choosing between boosting special or taking a perk. In fact, an odd historical note here, the system in Fallout 4 is actually strangely reminiscent of the GURPS mechanic that almost made up the core of Fallout 1, where a single currency can be assigned to either a primary attribute or boosting a more specific skill instead. But there are of course problems, both in concept and execution. Conceptually, there was the issue that this meant a player could, if they wished, build a character who started with Charisma 10, and thus be, at level 1, pretty much as good at speech as you can be, leading to baffling scenarios where bleary-eyed sole survivors emerged from the vault and ran straight into nonsense like this.
Easy there, Vault Girl. This doesn't involve you.
You stop waving that gun in my face, or it's gonna involve me.
Okay, just take it easy. We'll lower our weapons, alright? Just don't do anything crazy.
Now hand over your money. All of it.
Just keep calm, alright? Here. That's everything I have.
Now get the hell out of here. Both of you.
You gotta be kidding me. Fine. We'll leave. Just my goddamn luck.
There's also a fair bit of frogeting here. You see, Fallout 4 uncapped special, so you could utilise gear, food and drugs to boost charisma over 10 if you wanted to maximise your chances.
That's good.
But the system is basically pointless, because if you have Charisma 11, you will pass every single check in the game 100% of the time, and with plus 2 Charisma clothing everywhere and plus 5 Charisma Great Mentats not uncommon, hitting 11 was ludicrously simple, even for those with low Charisma.
That's bad.
So in reality, coming off a couple of Fallout games where it was far too easy to max out speech to low level, Fallout 4 made it even easier to temporarily max out Charisma whenever you needed it. Most people just didn't realise it because it was hidden behind an unclear coloured check system. And speaking of that, yes, the UI, as the mechanism by which players communicated with other characters itself did a lot of damage to speech checks when the 4 slots were already being filled up with yes, no, sarcastic and one question. And even when there were speech checks, the majority were extremely mundane. In fact, speech in Fallout 4 is 95% of the time relegated to negotiating rewards, where a check can get you a handful of extra caps. But there was really no shortage of caps in the world, and generally not much to buy with them, so this really didn't do much. And the saddest thing is, I think Fallout 4 was really trying, because you know how I've been mentioning repeatedly how good it is when a game rewards you for gathering a piece of information from the wider world and giving you a unique resolution to a quest if you've got it? Fallout 4 does that all the time.
That's good.
The problem is, all 12 bits of information that assist with other quests come from the same source, Mama Murphy. So once you know about that, you just nip back to Sanctuary Hills to put another dose of drugs into the quest solution vending machine, which completely removes any feeling of achievement from exploring or engaging with the world.
That's bad.
This system just didn't work for one simple reason. There aren't enough meaningful speech checks in the game to make investing in charisma just for that purpose worthwhile, and far too many charisma boosting items to make it worth bothering with even if you did want to pass the odd extremely rare important speech check. And plot twist here, despite my snark earlier, as of Wastelanders, Fallout 76 has actually come up with a much better system of speech checks. Probably the best in the 3D Fallout games after New Vegas in fact, even though it's a very simple system. It simply uses all of your special stats to stand in for speech checks of varying flavours, strength checks to represent intimidation, charisma checks to charm, perception to make astute observations. It's far from perfect and feels like a very simplified version of New Vegas' system in a way, but it is at least vastly superior to Fallout 4, and does come up with a flawed answer to some of the problems we've raised so far. So, how about a bit of theory crafting? How do we solve the problem of speech? Well, let's look at a handful of examples here. The Outer Worlds, of course, was directed by veterans of the original Fallout, and that tried to solve this problem with a very logical solution. Going right back to the discussion we had about GURPS, simply break speech out into different modes of speech. In this case, persuade, lie, and intimidate, where it is theoretically possible to have all 3 maxed out by the end of the game, absolutely, but it would take much more investment than it did in Fallout 3 or New Vegas, making a much bigger dent in your other abilities. But the Outer Worlds had problems too. Most immediately, all 3 skills were collected in a single dialogue group, meaning they level up together during the first 50 points of investment. This, I think, is a major mistake, because it undermines role-playing and the idea that your character has a distinct personality. Instead, you're simultaneously charming, deceptive, and intimidating. Personally, I would have separated these out into different groups. Intimidate alongside melee attacks and other physical skills, Lying alongside stealth, lockpick and other underhand abilities, and Persuade alongside science, medicine and other intelligence-based skills. This would lead to characters in the early to mid game mostly having access to only one of the 3 dialogue skills, at least initially, providing a much more consistent characterization to the captain you were role-playing as. The other issue with this Outer Worlds system is a more general one. Though they're separated into 3 skills, in real terms, there's very little difference between the 3. Extremely often you'll see 2 or more simultaneous dialogue options available, and while each might produce a different response from the NPC, there's almost never a practical difference. You don't have to consider the consequences of the exact lie you're telling, the potential damage to your reputation from intimidating somebody prominent, or generally whether your target is more likely to be swayed by persuasion, lies or intimidation. 99% of the time, all 3 skills function as a free problem solve button, just like speech does in Fallout. The Outer Worlds also runs straight into the Lanius problem. How do you deal with a final boss when you want to provide non-combat solutions, but speech 100 creates a huge anticlimax? Well, basically in the Outer Worlds it's done by requiring combinations of high skill checks, which works pretty well for the most part. Skill points aren't so liberally thrown around in the Outer Worlds, but the right combination of gear and followers can get you a handful of really high stats by the end of the game. The problem this goes on to create, however, is that the game presents you with a few different options, but without the exact right combination of skills, such as needing lockpick 100 to access a crucial hacking terminal, you might end up as a hacking specialist who can't use the hacking solution regardless because you didn't also have access to another skill that you had no way of knowing you would need. An improvement then, but not perfect. But perhaps we're looking at this the wrong way, because perhaps we don't actually need a speech skill to handle speech and specifically persuasion. Maybe we don't need a number that tells us whether or not we can talk someone round. So I'd like to discuss 2 mechanics that could form the basis of a persuasion system, both of which are perfectly workable as they've both been utilised in some degree by previous Fallout games. And those systems are reputation and knowledge. So reputation, of course, is a system that Obsidian has played with a lot. In New Vegas, new speech options can appear based on your faction reputation, talking your way past NCR personnel if you're popular with the NCR, for example. The Outer Worlds features this system too, though it does seem to have extremely limited usage. Fallout 3 used a similar, if more basic system with karma, where NPCs might react to you differently based on a general perception of you being good or bad. But even the execution in New Vegas is fairly simple. It's just a tally of how many good things and how many bad things you've done to a particular faction. But what if the game started tracking more things in the background to build up a wider, more complex picture of who you are and what you're known for? What if the game tracked how many kills you had against your name and gave some NPCs a preference for dealing with pacifists or more respect for an experienced warrior? Because this is hardly difficult stuff. Every Fallout game does track this number. New Vegas even used it to give you little perks, like the tiered Lord Death perk. Fallout 2 also showed a system of special reputational perks that I've discussed previously, where certain major feats made you something of a local celebrity, generating unique responses. Now, the more I think about it, is there any reason why an entire speech system couldn't function like this? Why can't people's reactions to you be a dynamic function of how they feel about what you've done, your reputation, and your local actions? In fact, I'm going to bring up a slightly old example here. Consider Crusader Kings 2. Now, if you want somebody to do something for you, you simply need to have them like you enough. Sure, your diplomacy stat, working a bit like charisma in this example, helps a bit, but it's a small part of a wider puzzle. Do you have a reputation for being kind? Most people will like that, though some will actively dislike it. Have you done anything for that person in particular? Have you done anything good or bad to the wider community they live in? Do you have a similar personality to them? Are you part of the same religion or society? Are they related to someone who you already have a strong relationship with? Or have you done something bad to somebody they hate? Have you bribed them? Do you know a secret about them that they want you to keep hidden? All these things factor into how characters in Crusader Kings like each other, which is itself used to determine whether they're willing to back you when the time comes. And I don't see any reason why we couldn't have a relation system like that running in an action RPG too. New Vegas already used both faction reputation and, on rare occasions, karma to create unique responses. it tracks kills, it tracks thefts, and all sorts of other things. The data is all there. Adding a list of preferences to NPCs and an invisible back-end relationship counter doesn't seem unworkable to me, and I think it would do a lot to make NPCs feel more alive, as opposed to the current purely factional system where 90% of the people you meet are part of a strange hive mind, where they all share the exact same collective opinion of you, regardless of whether or not the help you gave their town benefited them directly in any way. And we do in fact have examples of this exact system working in Fallout games. In Older World Blues, the think tank can be dealt with if you've persuaded over half their members to back you, but the best example actually comes from Fallout 4. In Far Harbor, at one of the DLC's key moments, when the town is ready to execute Dima, the player character can try to step in to save him, but will only succeed if the town decides to back you. There is no speech check at this moment. Instead, every person in the town has their own personality, their own view on the matter. Some will back you if you helped them. Some will refuse to support you even if you did help them, if you did it in a way that they disagree with. Some are swayed by whether other people are speaking up or not, some are actively opposed to you, some prefer to abstain. This sort of speech system is a lot harder to put together, of course, because it effectively means that every character has their own personal reputation system, but it is a lot more interesting and immersive than a simple speech skill or community reputation number. Now, the second part of a potential persuasion system is knowledge, and this one's very simple and already appears in Fallout to varying degrees as we've been discussing. Quite simply, you have to learn about things to bring them up in conversation, thereby opening up new possibilities. The most famous example of this, of course, is learning that the super mutants are sterile and telling the Master about it, though this did also appear in the Superhuman Gambit in Fallout 3 as we touched upon. Now, in a knowledge system, there's no need for skill checks pertaining to speech. Your character just needs to have learnt the information from somewhere. And there's a fundamental reason why I think this is a good system. Simply, it rewards players who immerse themselves fully in the world. If you engage with the lore, if you explore thoroughly, if you get to understand the world, meet people, speak to them at length, you're rewarded with new solutions. Now, we've mentioned earlier how some speech systems can function as auto-win buttons. This is how you get around that. In modern Fallout, if you want to fight, you don't just need the gun skill, you need to aim, utilise cover, in short, there is gameplay. If you want to sneak, you don't just need the sneak skill, you need to mind enemy line of sight, use shadows, there is gameplay. And if you want to use speech in a knowledge-based system, you don't just boost your speech skill, you need to have explored the world well enough to know what to say. Thus, there is gameplay in speech. So let me come back round to where we began, the Lanius question. How would Lanius be handled under this sort of a proposed system? So let's say you wanted to chase him off by scaring him. That would logically require an extremely strong reputation. Perhaps you'd need to have killed a large number of Legion troopers, including a good number of named Legion commanders. Perhaps you'd have to have already stormed the fort and killed Caesar himself. Perhaps if you were well known as an extremely skilled warrior, possibly even from what you are wearing if it included some very gory trophies, that could be enough to make Lanius run. Or alternatively, what if before choosing a side, you were able to learn enough about Legion tactics to give the NCR a tactical advantage? If you did enough work with Chief Hanlon or Cassandra Moore and impressed them enough, you could get yourself promoted highly enough within the NCR to start having strategic input into their formations and battle tactics and set up a superior trap to defeat the Legion. If the final battle went particularly well for the NCR because of your input, perhaps Lanius would be more willing to abandon a lost cause. Or what if, say, at the end of the Great Khan's quest, when they choose to leave the Mojave, you could do some research and discover some of the Legion's eastern holdings were vulnerable because of Lanius moving troops to the dam. What if you could persuade the Khans to head east and attack those Legion towns, and then, during the final battle, tell Lanius about it, making him immediately withdraw to protect the east, but only if you're willing to accept that will almost certainly lead to the Khans being wiped out. Now, you could come up with other examples, of course, but that's a handful of potential solutions. One based on reputation, two based on knowledge, that could be used to chase off Lanius in a way that I believe would feel a lot less anticlimactic because it takes a lot more setup to accomplish than simply making the stat speech have the number 100 next to it. That's just some thoughts from me on speech and the history of Fallout. I've been meaning to do this one for quite a while actually. More Fallout video essays to come, ladies and gentlemen, but in the meantime, I've been John, this has been many a true nerd, and this has been Fallout and the Trouble with Speech. Thank you very much, and goodbye. If we just hide the bodies, nobody needs to know about this. Yes! My stupid plan has worked! It turns out I'm a genius! The giant rat scorpion is not gone! Oh, hang on, there's more yet, though. I'm still being very shocked. Guys, where's the NCR? Nobody needs to know.